War Zone D, South Vietnam. Before dawn, June 1965, a column of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters moves through triple canopy jungle, following a route their commanders chose weeks earlier. They carry rice, ammunition, and the confidence of an army that has beaten a Western power before. 9 years earlier, their predecessors surrounded a French garrison at a place called Dien Bien Phu and forced an empire to leave Indochina. The lesson they carried into this jungle was simple. Mass your strength, strike the enemy's weak point, and the larger force wins. Nothing in that lesson prepared them for what happened next. There was no siren, no spotter plane circling overhead, no engine noise building in the distance, because the aircraft delivering this attack were flying so high that their sound would not reach the ground until after the bombs already had. 27 B-52 Stratofortresses, built to carry nuclear weapons across oceans, released their bomb loads over a jungle base area outside Saigon. In under a minute, 5 square kilometers of forest disappeared under high explosives. For the soldiers on the ground, survival was not a matter of skill, cover, or courage. It was a matter of whether the grid coordinates chosen months earlier by planners on Guam happened to include the patch of jungle where they stood. Concentration, the very doctrine that had defeated the French, had just become a death sentence delivered from an altitude no one on the ground could see. This is not simply the story of the B-52, the aircraft that dropped more tonnage on Vietnam than the Allies dropped in all of World War II. Airplanes and bomb tonnage are only half of any war story. The other half is what an enemy does when the old rules stop working. Within 2 years, the same army that had walked into War Zone D in tight columns had transformed itself. Units that once moved and fought in concentrated formations learned to disperse into small, camouflaged elements. Soldiers who once built above-ground camps began digging permanent tunnel systems designed to survive saturation bombing. And in combat, some units developed something almost paradoxical. They learned to fight the Americans by moving closer to them, not farther away, a tactic American troops would come to call hugging, because getting close enough to grab an opponent's belt meant an opponent's artillery, and airstrikes could no longer be called in without killing their own men. The central question of this story is not whether the B-52 was a powerful weapon. It obviously was. The question is how an army with no answer to that power in the air found an answer on the ground, and what that adaptation reveals about the actual limits of even the most overwhelming firepower in human history. None of that transformation was visible yet on this June morning in 1965. What was visible to anyone who survived it was a simple, unsettling fact. An army that had planned its entire war around finding the enemy first now had to reckon with an enemy who could find them without ever being seen at all. By the end of the war, American air power would drop an unprecedented tonnage of bombs on a country smaller than California. And yet, the force those bombs were meant to destroy did not just survive. It learned, adapted, and in some of the war's most decisive battles, fought on terms the B-52 alone could not solve. To understand how that happened, we have to go back to where the North Vietnamese Army's confidence came from in the first place, and why a doctrine built to beat the French turned into a liability against the Americans. To understand why North Vietnamese commanders walked into 1965 confident in concentration of force, you have to understand what that doctrine had already won them. In 1954, Vietnamese forces under General Von Nguyen Giap surrounded a French garrison at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley chosen by French commanders because they believed no Asian army could move enough artillery through the surrounding mountains to threaten it. Giap's forces proved them wrong. Over weeks, Vietnamese soldiers hauled heavy guns piece by piece through jungle terrain the French considered impassable, concentrated overwhelming firepower against a single fixed position, and forced a French surrender that effectively ended nearly a century of French colonial rule in Indochina. The doctrine that produced that victory was not complicated. Identify the enemy's fixed point of weakness, move troops and firepower into position undetected, mass overwhelming strength at the moment of attack. It was classical, Maoist-influenced revolutionary warfare, built on the assumption that a smaller, more mobile force could concentrate at the decisive place and time faster than a larger, more static one could react. By the mid-1960s, that same logic shaped how the North Vietnamese Army organized itself in the South. Regiments and divisions established base areas in remote jungle regions like War Zone D and War Zone C near the Cambodian border. These were not scattered guerrilla camps. They were semi-permanent installations, training grounds, supply depots, hospitals, and staging areas for regiment and battalion-sized units preparing to strike South Vietnamese and, increasingly, American forces. The doctrine assumed a particular kind of enemy, one who had to find you before he could hurt you. Reconnaissance patrols, artillery spotters, air strikes that required someone on the ground or in a low-flying aircraft to identify a target first. Under those conditions, concentration in a remote camouflaged base was relatively safe. The jungle canopy alone had defeated French aerial reconnaissance for years. What Vietnamese commanders had no framework for, because no army anywhere in the world had faced it before in this context, was an aircraft that did not need to see them at all. The B-52 Stratofortress was never designed for this war. It was built in the 1950s as the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent, intended to fly at high altitude and deliver nuclear weapons against fixed strategic targets, cities, industrial centers, missile fields. By the time Strategic Air Command modified the aircraft under a program called Big Belly to carry conventional bombs instead, each B-52D could carry roughly 30 tons of ordnance, up to 108 individual bombs, and release them from an altitude of over 30,000 feet, high enough that the aircraft could neither be seen nor heard from the ground until the bombs were already falling. Against a fixed, concentrated target, exactly the kind of base area North Vietnamese doctrine relied on. This was not simply a more powerful weapon than anything the North Vietnamese Army had previously faced. It was a fundamentally different kind of threat. Artillery could be heard coming. Fighter bombers could sometimes be seen and, if spotted early enough, given a target area that troops could scatter from. The B-52, flying above both sound and sight, offered no such window. A concentrated base area that had taken months to build and stock with supplies could be erased in the time it took the bomb bay doors to open and close. These base areas functioned as small, self-contained towns hidden under jungle canopy. Workshops repaired weapons and produced simple ordnance. Rice caches and medical stations supported units passing through on their way to and from combat. Training grounds prepared new recruits arriving from the north. None of this infrastructure was designed with any particular concern for concealment from the air, because for years, concealment from the ground, from South Vietnamese patrols, French colonial forces before them, and early American reconnaissance, had been more than sufficient. The canopy that hid these bases from a soldier walking beneath it hid them just as effectively from a pilot flying a few thousand feet above it in an ordinary fighter-bomber, the kind of aircraft that had to see a target or be guided onto one by someone who could before it could strike. On June 18, 1965, that gap between doctrine and reality closed for the first time. Operation ArcLight's opening strike hit a Viet Cong base area in War Zone D, and for the North Vietnamese Army, a doctrine that had defeated a European colonial power suddenly needed an answer it did not have. The first ArcLight strikes did not immediately break North Vietnamese resolve. What they broke was a set of assumptions about how safe a rear base area actually was. Reports reaching Hanoi and Southern commanders in the months after June 1965 described an attack unlike anything Vietnamese forces had documented before. No warning. Damage spread across an area large enough to swallow an entire base camp, and destruction that took place before any lookout could report aircraft overhead. For a doctrine built around the idea that a well-hidden concentration of force was a safe concentration of force, this was not an incremental problem. It undercut the basic premise. Among the officers who had to answer that problem directly was Senior Colonel Hoang Cam, commanding the 9th Viet Cong Division, a unit built around North Vietnamese Army regulars operating in South Vietnam. Cam's forces fought some of the earliest major engagements against American ground troops in 1965, and in doing so, he began to notice something specific about how American units used their supporting firepower. American commanders, Cam observed, generally tried to keep a buffer zone between their own troops and enemy forces in contact, space that let them call in artillery and airstrikes onto the enemy without endangering their own men. That buffer was not a weakness in American doctrine. It was the entire point of American firepower superiority. Keep distance, let artillery and aircraft do the killing. But a buffer zone is a two-way relationship. If the enemy refuses to hold his side of that distance, the buffer collapses, and with it, much of the advantage it was built to protect. This observation did not arrive as a single breakthrough. It emerged from a string of engagements in late 1965 where the pattern showed up in different forms. At Ap Namat in December, an American infantry battalion managed to achieve exactly the kind of separation Cam described, pulled back from contact, and brought in devastating supporting fire. A battle that went badly for the Viet Cong regiment that attacked it. Weeks earlier, at a small clearing called Landing Zone Albany, The opposite happened. A composite battalion from the 66th NVA Regiment ambushed an American cavalry battalion at close range, and the fighting collapsed into hand-to-hand combat across the column almost immediately. An American fire support officer overhead had artillery, gunships, and air support available, and for critical minutes, almost none of it could be safely used because friendly and enemy soldiers were too intermixed to target one without hitting the other. Landing Zone Albany was costly and chaotic for both sides, but for officers like Cam, watching the pattern repeat itself, it demonstrated something with real tactical value. The deadliest thing about American firepower was not the firepower itself, it was the space around it. Take away the space, and the advantage did not simply shrink. In the middle of a close engagement, it could functionally disappear. This was the seed of what American troops would soon start calling hugging, staying close enough to grab an opponent's belt, close enough that no forward observer could call in a strike without risking his own men. It began as a battlefield observation made under fire, not as a doctrine issued from Hanoi, but by 1966, a U.S. Military Assistance Command summary was already acknowledging the pattern as deliberate. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, it noted, used these close contact tactics specifically to protect themselves from Allied artillery and air power. The lesson Colonel Cam and officers like him were learning in late 1965 solved one problem: how to survive American firepower in direct ground combat. It did nothing for the much larger problem waiting in the rear: an aircraft that did not need ground contact with anyone to erase an entire base area from the map. Surviving the B-52 would require something bigger than a battlefield tactic. It would require rebuilding how the entire Army moved, gathered, and lived in the field. If proximity to American troops could neutralize firepower in direct combat, distance from American intelligence could do something similar against the B-52, but only if that distance was combined with an entirely different way of organizing an army in the field. The shift that followed was not a single order issued from Hanoi and adopted overnight. It was a gradual redesign of how North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units lived, moved, and prepared for combat, driven by the same blunt lesson repeated across dozens of base areas. Anything large enough and static enough to be found was large enough and static enough to be destroyed. The most visible expression of that redesign was underground. Tunnel networks had existed in Vietnam since the war against the French, but under the pressure of arc light and other American bombing campaigns, they expanded into something closer to permanent subterranean infrastructure. In the Cu Chi district northwest of Saigon, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese engineers eventually extended tunnel systems across roughly 250 kilometers built on multiple levels, deep enough that surface bombing often could not reach the lowest chambers. These were not simple hiding holes. They contained field hospitals, weapons and ammunition storage, command posts, and living quarters. An entire parallel infrastructure built specifically so that daily military life did not have to happen on a surface the B-52 could see and target. Movement changed just as fundamentally as shelter did. Units that once marched in relatively compact columns during daylight shifted toward night movement, staggered formations, and smaller unit sizes designed to avoid presenting a target large enough to justify, or even require, a full arc light strike. Camouflage discipline tightened. Base areas that once functioned as semi-permanent installations were increasingly built to be abandoned and relocated, denying American intelligence the fixed, repeatedly observable target that made a target worth bombing in the first place. Command and control adapted alongside physical movement. Larger operations that once might have been coordinated from a single regimental headquarters increasingly relied on smaller, more dispersed command posts, connected by runners and short-range communication rather than concentrated at one identifiable location. Supply caches that had once been consolidated into a few large depots were broken into smaller, redundant stores scattered across a wider area, so that losing one to a bombing raid meant losing days of supply rather than weeks. None of these individual changes was dramatic on its own. Together, they amounted to an entire army learning to behave as though it were always being watched, whether or not it actually was. None of this made North Vietnamese forces invisible. American reconnaissance, informants, and signals intelligence continued to locate concentrations of enemy activity throughout the war. What the adaptation did was raise the cost and lower the frequency of the scenario arclight needed most. A large, identifiable static formation sitting still long enough for a strike to be planned, approved, and flown. The tactical proof that this approach could work came in close combat, in exactly the pattern Colonel Kame and others had already begun to exploit. Through 1996, American after-action reports and engagement studies documented a recurring frustration. Units that closed to point-blank range during an assault deliberately kept themselves too intermixed with American troops for supporting fire to be called in safely. It was not a universal solution. Plenty of engagements still ended with devastating American firepower breaking an attack before it could close that distance. But when it worked precisely because the tactic attacked the seam in American doctrine, not the doctrine's strength. American firepower depended on separation to function. Take the separation away, and for as long as the fighting stayed close, the B-52 sitting on strip alert on Guam might as well not have existed. By late 1966, the pattern was clear enough that it had shifted from an improvised battlefield reaction into something closer to standard practice, taught and expected rather than discovered fresh in each engagement. The North Vietnamese Army had not found a way to shoot down the B-52, jam its radar, or intercept its bombs. It had found something arguably more durable, a way to make its own army harder to see, harder to catch concentrated, and in direct contact, too dangerous to bomb at all. That adaptation solved the tactical problem. It did nothing to answer what would happen when circumstance, not choice, forced North Vietnamese forces back into the one configuration the entire adaptation was designed to avoid. A large, concentrated force with nowhere left to disperse. While individual units were learning to disperse and hug their way around American firepower, a parallel adaptation was taking shape at a much larger scale, one that would determine whether North Vietnam could keep feeding troops and supplies south at all. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was never a single road. It was a shifting network of paths, river crossings and way stations running through the mountains and jungles of Laos and Cambodia, built to move soldiers, weapons, food, and medical supplies from North Vietnam into the southern battlefields. As ArcLight expanded beyond South Vietnam's borders and began striking trail routes directly, the same logic that reshaped individual base areas reshaped the trail's entire operating philosophy. Where earlier movement along the trail had relied on relatively fixed routes and staging areas, planners increasingly dispersed the network into parallel and redundant paths, so that the destruction of any single route or way station did not sever the supply line. Way stations shrank in size and increased in number, trading efficiency for survivability. Anti-aircraft positions were pushed forward to protect key choke points like mountain passes, while porters and truck convoys shifted toward night movement whenever possible, timed around known American reconnaissance patterns. Porters and truck drivers along the trail learned to read the rhythms of American reconnaissance almost the way sailors read weather. Convoys timed movement around periods of reduced aerial activity, dispersed vehicles at wide intervals rather than traveling in tight columns, and relied on layered anti-aircraft positions to protect the most exposed stretches of road, particularly at mountain passes and river crossings, where the terrain itself narrowed the available routes and made avoidance harder. None of these measures eliminated losses. They simply made the trail resilient enough to keep functioning despite them, which, for a logistics network under years of continuous bombing, was itself a significant achievement. The Air Force, for its part, was not standing still either. In October 1965, engineers began modifying B-52s to carry more than 3 times their original conventional bomb load, work that went operational the following spring. Alongside it, the Air Force installed a ground-directed bombing system called Combat Sky Spot, using radar guidance to strike targets through jungle canopy and poor weather with far greater precision than earlier missions had allowed. By April 1966, ArcLight strikes were reaching as far as the Mu Gia Pass on the North Vietnamese border, hitting one of the trail's key funnel points with the largest single bombing raid of the war to that point. This back and forth, heavier bombs and better targeting on one side, deeper dispersal and redundancy on the other, became the defining rhythm of the trail war for the rest of the decade. Neither side achieved a clean victory in it. American bombing never closed the trail, but it forced North Vietnam to commit enormous manpower and engineering resources simply to keep the supply line functioning at all. Road repair crews, anti-aircraft units, dispersed storage depots, and a logistics apparatus built from the ground up around the assumption that any fixed point could be found and destroyed. The same logic applied inside South Vietnam whenever American ground operations pushed into North Vietnamese base areas. In November 1965, in the Ia Drang Valley region, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division uncovered a secret base area containing 2 regular North Vietnamese regiments along with additional Viet Cong units. As ground fighting intensified, commanders called in 18 B-52s, which dropped over 300 tons of bombs on enemy positions along the surrounding slopes, part of a combined effort with nearly 400 tactical air sorties and artillery fire that helped turn back the enemy counterattacks. Weeks later, in December, B-52s supported Marine and South Vietnamese operations further north, again striking concentrations that ground forces had located and fixed in place. What these engagements demonstrated was not that dispersal had failed. It was that dispersal only worked as protection when North Vietnamese commanders had the freedom to choose it. When American ground forces made contact first and pinned a concentration in place before it could disperse, Arclight's advantage reasserted itself immediately and violently. The adaptation was not a shield against every circumstance. It was a shield against being found while still, by choice, sitting still. That distinction between an army that chooses to disperse and an army forced by circumstance to concentrate would define the single most consequential test of this entire adaptation, one that was still 2 years away at a Marine combat base near the Laotian border called Sanh. In January 1968, the adaptation that had protected North Vietnamese forces for 2 years collided with a scenario its own logic had always warned against. At Sanh, a Marine combat base near the border with Laos, North Vietnamese commanders committed an estimated 20,000 troops to a prolonged siege, one of the largest concentrations of North Vietnamese Army manpower assembled against a single American position during the entire war. The strategic goal was to pin down and potentially overrun the garrison, echoing the siege tactics that had worked at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier. But a siege, by its nature, requires exactly the condition the past 2 years of adaptation had been built to avoid: a large force positioned in a relatively fixed area for a sustained period of time, surrounding a location the enemy already knows precisely. For the North Vietnamese Army, there was no way around this contradiction. To besiege Sanh at all meant abandoning, at least locally, the dispersal that had kept units safe elsewhere. Trench networks, bunkers, and tunnels around the base offered real protection, echoing the underground infrastructure North Vietnamese engineers had spent 2 years refining. But protection from ground assault and protection from saturation bombing were not the same problem, and the concentration required to maintain a credible siege gave American air planners something they had rarely had elsewhere in the war: a known, bounded, persistent target area. The American response matched the scale of the opportunity. B-52s flew in 3 aircraft formations called cells, saturating target boxes roughly 1 mile by half a mile with high explosives, in strikes coordinated around the clock and combined with tactical air power and resupply operations to keep the Marine garrison holding. Over the following weeks, the weight of bombing directed against the besieging force was immense, striking positions that intelligence and reconnaissance had identified with far more confidence than anywhere along the dispersed, constantly shifting Ho Chi Minh Trail. Marine defenders on the ground described the bombing as almost continuous during the heaviest weeks of the siege, close enough at times that the concussion of nearby strikes could be felt through the trench walls. For North Vietnamese soldiers dug into positions ringing the base, The experience was the mirror image of everything the previous 2 years of adaptation had been designed to prevent. Fixed positions, known to the enemy, struck repeatedly over an extended period, with no realistic option to disperse without abandoning the siege altogether. The siege ultimately lifted in April 1968, and the Marine base held. Historians continue to debate exactly how much credit belongs to B-52 bombing specifically, as opposed to the combined weight of tactical air support, artillery, and the Marines' own defense. Precise North Vietnamese casualty figures from the siege remain contested, complicated by jungle terrain, dispersed burial practices, and the fog that surrounds any battle fought this heavily from the air. What is not seriously disputed is the underlying pattern. When North Vietnamese forces were forced into sustained concentration by their own operational choices, Arclight performed exactly as its designers had intended. Khe Sanh was not evidence that the North Vietnamese adaptation to Arclight had failed. It was evidence of its actual boundary. Dispersal, tunneling, and close contact tactics had solved the problem of surviving American firepower during mobile engagements, and while occupying jungle base areas that could be abandoned and relocated on short notice. None of those tools solved the problem of a siege, which by definition required staying in one place, in strength, for weeks. The North Vietnamese Army had built an entire operational doctrine around not doing the one thing that a successful siege of Khe Sanh required it to do. That contradiction would not stay confined to a single battle. 4 years later, in the spring of 1972, it would resurface on a much larger scale, in a battle that would show just how far both the adaptation and its limits had evolved by the final years of American involvement. By the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese Army had abandoned guerrilla dispersal for something closer to conventional warfare. The Nguyen Hue Offensive, known to Americans as the Easter Offensive, sent entire divisions supported by tanks and artillery across the border in a direct conventional assault. The largest concentration of North Vietnamese conventional forces committed to a single campaign up to that point in the war. At An Loc, a provincial capital north of Saigon, North Vietnamese forces besieged a South Vietnamese garrison for nearly 3 months, in conditions that once again forced sustained concentration around a fixed objective. As at Khe Sanh, B-52 strikes played a decisive role in blunting the assault, striking staging areas and armored formations that, unlike the dispersed units of 1966, had no realistic way to disperse without abandoning the offensive's entire objective. Nixon had resumed and expanded American bombing that same year, and the buildup of B-52 forces at Anderson Air Force Base under Operation Bullet Shot reflected just how central this weapon remained to American strategy, 7 years after its first controversial use over a jungle base area outside Saigon. The pattern from 1968 repeated with even higher stakes, when circumstances forced North Vietnamese forces into sustained concentration. The very adaptation that had protected them for years offered little defense. The tunnels, the dispersal, the close contact tactics, all of it had been built to solve the problem of a guerrilla or semi-conventional army trying to survive while remaining hidden and mobile. None of it addressed what happened when the strategic goal itself required massed armor and infantry to sit in place, in the open, for weeks at a time. It would be tempting to end this story with a clean lesson that the North Vietnamese Army out-adapted American air power, or conversely, that Khe Sanh and An Loc prove Arc Light won the war on its own. The evidence supports something more measured than either claim. The adaptation was real, and by any honest reading of the record it worked, reliably enough, in enough engagements across enough years, to force American commanders to accept that close combat with North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units often meant fighting without the firepower advantage that was supposed to define the entire war. But the adaptation was also bounded. It solved the problem of hiding an army. It never solved the problem of what happened when that army had to stop hiding. The human cost of this contest ran in both directions. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong casualties from years of bombing remain genuinely difficult to establish with precision. The jungle terrain that made units hard to target also made accurate casualty counting nearly impossible after the fact, and official figures from both sides during the war carried strong incentives toward exaggeration or understatement. What is not in dispute is the toll of the adaptation itself. Years spent living underground in tunnel systems, the physical exhaustion of constant movement and dispersal, and combat that, when it did happen at close range, was often more brutal and more personal than the standoff warfare American doctrine had been designed around. On the American side, the tactic of hugging meant that some of the war's most violent close-quarters engagements, including Landing Zone Albany, occurred precisely because artillery and air support, the tools meant to protect American troops, could not be used at the moment they were needed most. What made the outcome of this contest possible in the end came down to a small number of factors working together, rather than any single weapon or tactic. North Vietnamese doctrine's willingness to abandon a proven method, concentration of force, the moment it stopped working, rather than clinging to it out of institutional pride. The construction of physical infrastructure in the form of tunnel networks, substantial enough to make dispersal survivable over years, not just days. A precise reading of the seam in American firepower doctrine, the gap between separation and proximity that close contact tactics could exploit. And, just as important, American air power's own evolution. Heavier bomb loads, radar-directed targeting, and a willingness to concentrate bombing wherever the enemy could be forced to concentrate in turn. The B-52 never lost its power to destroy a fixed target. What it lost, over the course of this adaptation, was the certainty that a fixed target would still be there in that configuration by the time the bombs arrived. That is the quieter, less cinematic form of victory the North Vietnamese Army achieved against Arc Light, not by defeating the aircraft, but by denying it, as often as circumstances allowed, the only kind of target it was ever built to destroy. The lesson would outlast the war itself. In the decades that followed, American military planners studied this exact contest, a technologically overwhelming air power against a dispersed, adaptive ground force, as a case study in the limits of firepower alone. overwhelming force can destroy anything it can find. The harder, more enduring problem, one this jungle war made unavoidable, is what happens when the enemy simply refuses to be found.